Just make sure the
Okay,
screen
it's that.
light goes off.
Okay, well, hello everyone. We're gonna get started with the Budget Committee meeting. I'm gonna call the meeting to order at 6:34 p.m. And just so folk know, Judah is excused this evening and won't be here, but the rest of us are here. And then we have nomination and election of officers. I don't have a script. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. We do not need a motion, just names of the people you would like to nominate for the position of Budget Committee Chair. Does anyone wish to make a nomination?
Chair, I nominate Andrew Furbrug for chair.
Okay. Andrew has been nominated by Sammy,
I accept that nomination.
has been accepted. Harry, and let's see, are there any other names that would like to be offered? Just a double check. Okay. Hearing no objections or further nominations, the nominations are closed. And would you like to offer why you would be a good chair?
Not really.
Oh, wait, that's multiple. Sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't have the script. I'm sorry, y'all. Okay, we're going to take a vote. I'm going to ask that we do unanimous consent on Andrew as chair of the Budget Committee. Are there any objections? Okay. Hearing no objections, congratulations, Andrew. I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to you.
Thank you very much. Now we get to move to the vice chair. So pretty much same thing. We do not need a motion, just names of the people you would like to nominate for the position of Budget Committee Vice Chair. Does anyone wish to make a nomination?
Is there somebody that would be comfortable that we could, I'd be happy to nominate you if you are willing to do it.
As long as Andrew stays, it's a ceremonial position.
Okay, I would like to nominate Penny because she said sure.
Thank you all. I accept.
Okay, we've got a nomination and acceptance. Anybody else have anyone they wish to nominate? Going once, going twice. All right. Hearing no objections or further nominations, the nominations are closed. I would also like to take this to appoint Penny York as vice chair via unanimous consent. If there is no objection, hearing none, congratulations. All right, so the committee secretary has advised me that the meeting minutes are unavailable for adoption tonight, so those will be moved to our next meeting. With that, I would like to invite Superintendent Noss to present his budget message for the year.
Budget Committee, colleagues, and Corvallis community, I submit to for your consideration the proposed budget for the Corvallis School District for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2024 and ending June 30th, 2025. The budget reflects our commitment to cultivate an inclusive educational environment where every student's voice matters, fostering equity and community wellness. At Corvallis School District, we provide exceptional learning experiences that prioritize academic success and engagement, empowering all students to succeed and pursue their goals. This budget cycle has been especially difficult as we have had to navigate an $8.2 million shortfall. Throughout this process, district leaders have worked diligently to prioritize our collective goals and keep students at the forefront of our decision-making. That being said, it is impossible to maintain our current service levels while meeting the requirements of local budget law. Our costs continue to rise while our revenues shrink. Over the past several years, our ability to enhance student services has been supported by robust fiscal reserves and the introduction of various state and federal initiatives, such as High School Success, the Student Investment Account, and Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, often considered COVID recovery funds. We've expanded our staff to better cater to the academic and social-emotional needs of our students during times of heightened necessity. Regrettably, our enrollment numbers are still on the decline, while state resources fail to match the escalating costs of school operations. Moreover, the pressing needs of our students persist even as funding to address them diminishes. To tackle these challenges, the proposed budget for 24-25 aims to utilize our remaining surplus reserves to strategically address the challenges we're facing. As the ESSER Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief funds approach their end, a looming funding cliff casts a shadow over public education. These critical resources have been instrumental in supporting schools during the challenging times brought on by the pandemic, enabling them to implement necessary safety measures, address learning loss, and provide essential services to students. However, as these funds will be fully expended by June 30, 2024, schools face the daunting prospect of navigating budget shortfalls and cuts to vital programs and services. Declining enrollment is a trend that we believe will continue based on recent birth rate statistics, combined with high housing costs that often deter young families from settling in Corvallis. As state funding is allocated based on the number of students we serve and the unique needs they have, we will need to closely monitor enrollment over the next few years and make changes as needed to align with our state resources. The housing crisis in our community is a pressing issue that requires urgent attention. As demand for housing continues to outpace supply, residents, particularly families with children, face significant challenges in finding affordable accommodations. This crisis not only impacts the well-being and stability of our students and families, but also has significant implications for our district. Addressing this crisis requires collaborative efforts between the community, policymakers, and stakeholders to implement sustainable solutions that ensure access to safe and affordable housing for all residents, safeguarding the educational opportunities and future success of our students and community. In Oregon, the issue of inadequate state funding in public education continues to pose significant challenges for students, educators, and communities statewide. Schools are tasked with navigating a wide variety of student and family needs. While our funding primarily supports education, the scope of our responsibilities extends far beyond. As districts, we are called upon to provide medical care, mental and behavioral health support, tackle issues of food and housing insecurity, support families navigating systems, and much more. Despite efforts to address these needs, schools are not funded to provide these services. This budget proposal includes a total investment of $176.7 million, represented by 5 separate funds, the largest of which is the general fund. The total budget for all funds represents a decrease of 11% compared to 23-24 amended budget, primarily due to the spending down of bond proceeds in the Capital Projects Fund as capital improvements in alignment with the bond measure approved by Corvallis voters in 2018 have been substantially completed. The general fund represents 64% of the 24-25 proposed budget for all funds and accounts for most operating activities of the district except those activities required to be accounted for in another fund. General fund revenues come from 2 main sources: local property taxes and the state school fund. Budgeted general fund current resources total $112.5 million, an increase of $7.5 million or 6.6% from 23-24. The majority of the increase in general fund resources is due to typical increase in property taxes and an increase in state funding per pupil due to statewide enrollment declines. In addition, the district has implemented several saving strategies in the current and previous fiscal year in preparation for the projected budget deficit. Budgeted general funds current requirements total $111.4 million, an increase in $7.3 million or 6.5% over 23-24. The general fund includes $10.5 million that funds approximately 68 FTE provided by the local option levy, which voters renewed in May of 2022. Because of the local option levy, our students experience smaller class sizes and receive specialized instruction in physical education, music, and art. The local option levy also provides students with more access to counseling and social work services, vocational and technical education programs, and extracurricular activities, and athletics. School Board Policy DA provides guidance regarding the financial objectives for managing general fund reserves. Those objectives include establishing a sustainable level of programs, protecting the district from unnecessary borrowing to meet cash flow needs, providing prudent reserves to meet unexpected emergencies, protecting against catastrophic events, and meeting the uncertainties of state and federal funding. As outlined in the policy, all general fund contingency and reserve accounts are budgeted to result in the minimum levels required. In conclusion, the proposed budget for 24-25 reflects our steadfast commitment to providing exceptional educational experiences while navigating challenging fiscal constraints. Despite facing an $8.2 million shortfall in the impending end of critical one-time relief funds like ESSER, our district remains dedicated to prioritizing student success and well-being. The decline in enrollment and the pressing housing crisis in our community further compounds these challenges, emphasizing the urgent need for sustainable funding solutions and collaborative efforts to ensure equitable access to education for all students. Despite these obstacles, the proposed budget seeks to strategically allocate resources and uphold our commitment to fiscal responsibility. Together with the support of our budget committee, colleagues in the Corvallis community, we remain resolute in our mission to cultivate a thriving educational environment where every student has the opportunity to flourish. Thank you for your consideration and support as we work towards a bright future for our students and our community. Respectfully submitted, Ryan Noss.
Thank you, Superintendent Noss. At this point, would like to invite Finance Director Lauren Wolf to present budget highlights.
Okay, before we get started, I just wanted to share a reminder about the Budget Committee roles and responsibilities. The Budget Committee does hear the budget message, which we just received from Superintendent Noss. We will hear and consider public comment after the presentation. You can discuss and revise the budget as needed, approve the budget, approve tax rate and levy amounts. So the Budget Committee does not set salaries, benefits, or contractual terms, set staffing levels or organizational structure, decide if a program or service should be funded, or make or alter district goals or policies. So as we go through this conversation tonight, just keep those parameters in mind. Okay. So here is a graphic showing the budget at a glance for all funds. As you know from Ryan's message, we are expecting a decline in our overall budget for the year of about 11%. You can tell that orange was pretty big portion of our budget in 2021, which represents the capital projects, and is now almost non-existent in that bar graph for the 24-25 year, as we have spent most of those revenues on the bond project. The total budget in general fund represents 64% of the overall budget, and accounts for most of the operating activities of the district. So the general fund revenues come from two main sources. That is our local property taxes and the state school fund. Okay, and now to take a look at the summary of resources for all of our funds here. In 24-25, the resources include local, intermediate, state, and federal sources. Other sources include transfers from other funds and beginning fund balance. In 24-25, the proposed revenue for all funds totals $176.7 million, a decrease of $18.6 million or 11%. So our state sources that is one of our larger buckets here, is largely comprised of the state school fund. And so those revenues total about $54 million, or 31% of all funds. Other sources, primarily the beginning fund balance, totals $28.3 million, or 16% of all sources for our major funding. One of the biggest variances to note in this section over the last year is the decrease in beginning fund balance carried forward, and that's really just as a result of those bond proceeds being spent down and not being carried over from the previous year. The next is a summary of all of our requirements. So as we've talked about before, local budget law requires us to present a balanced budget. Therefore, the expenditures or requirements match our revenues at $176.7 million, which is, again, a decrease of $18.6 million or 11% from the prior year. In 24-25, just like most years, if you're not operating a bond program, salary and associated costs is the largest chunk of our budget at about 53%. Let's see. And then the other thing to point out is in our other objects, those are things like our debt service payment requirements. So we have debt service for PERS, we have debt service for the general obligation bonds, and the other large cost there is our insurance costs. Okay, and now we're taking a look at our staffing allocation for all funds. So as you saw on the previous slide, that's our sort of biggest bucket of expenditures. So when you look at this here, I think it's important to point out that there's an increase of about $792,000 from previous year, but we've actually reduced staffing, and that's largely due to the expense that comes along with staffing. So we're not seeing a savings in that category just because of the increased costs year over year. Okay, so as we put together the budget, and this is really one of the main roles of the budget committee, is to make sure that you feel the assumptions that the budget was based around are appropriate. So I wanted to point those out again. Our assumptions for this budget is an enrollment of just over 6,000. Our salary and benefits costs are based on step increases for all groups, 5% cost of living increase, $50 increase on the monthly insurance contribution for all employees, and then we applied about an average 6% increase across all other objects. We know there's some that come in a little bit higher than that. For example, Our insurance renewal is probably going to come in about an 18% increase, and there's other areas that are staying a little bit stagnant where we may find some savings. So when we took into consideration all of those things and what we had previously talked about in our financial update, is there's a corrective action required from the current year of $8.2 million. So I think this is important to note as we talk about declining enrollment in our schools, is that the blue bar portion of this shows our student enrollment since 2014, 2015, and then the orange line that's going across shows our staffing levels in FTE. So as you can tell, when we look at this graph, the student enrollment has been declining for several years since that 2017-18 school year, and our staffing levels have increased during that time. Another important piece to point out, I think, on this page is just that those rates, the decrease in those the enrollment compared to the staffing FTE, if we look at our student to staff ratio, our student to staff ratio is the lowest that it has been in 10 years. So one of the biggest pieces that has been brought up through this process, through community or public comment or through the board and this committee, has been the school versus district level reduction. So I put together some information here for you so that you can review that. When we look at our the 23-24 amended budget, so the budget that we're currently operating in for this year, our FTE, our schools were directly allocated or received FTE from departments, and that equated to about 89% of the budget, and the district is having about 11% of staffing at the district level. When you look at the budget, it's split about 80-20. So then if we look at the decreases that we are proposing in this budget, the change over the prior year, schools are experiencing about a decrease in 7% FTE, whereas the district departments are experiencing a decrease of about a little over double that at 15%. And effectively, when you look at the dollar amount difference between that change, although we're decreasing 51 FTE in schools, we are only experiencing about a $200,000 decrease in cost. So there's a significant cost year over year on salaries and benefits, which is what that is related to. When you look again down at the departments, this is staffing specifically in the district office that is not supporting direct instruction with students. There's a $3 million decrease there, which is about, again, 15%. Those numbers just happen to align on the FTE and the total cost. Another thing to point out on this too is that the budget has shifted just a little bit to more dollars being allocated to schools at 82% versus 80% in the current year. Okay. And the second piece of information that we've really been discussing quite a bit, so I wanted to bring some information here for the group, is about the fiscal policy, DA. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it at this point, but I just wanted to provide some further information on that. So kind of the why behind fiscal policy DA is to establish an ending fund balance in an amount sufficient to deliver a sustainable level of programming, protect the district from unnecessary borrowing, provide prudent reserves to meet unexpected emergencies, meet the uncertainties of state and federal funding, and maintain a favorable credit rating. The specifics in our fiscal policy DA is a contingency reserve of 2.5%. That is for unanticipated expenditures or emergencies. There's the rainy day component at 5%, which is to address adverse economic conditions, and an unappropriated ending fund balance of 5%, which is unavailable for use in the current fiscal year. There's a few scenarios where that can be used, but it's pretty rare and uncommon. So the total CSD reserves required is 12.5%. And another important fact is if the reserves are accessed, the superintendent must propose a plan to restore budget stability, that's part A of that, and replenish the reserves within 3 years. Another thing we talk about a lot is the reserve balance comparability to other districts. So what I can tell you about this is school boards are allowed to use their own discretion on reserve amounts and creating their own policies. It's really difficult to compare policy to policy if we're just looking at DA because they can be written so differently. Ours is very prescriptive with those, not the amount, but the how it's divided into those 3 different buckets. And so really if you want to compare reserve balances across districts, you need to look at the ending fund balance and beginning fund balance that they're carrying over year to year as a proportion of their revenues. So what I did was take all of the districts that we use as our comparability group. Primarily we use that information when we're doing collective bargaining. But we look at districts based on locality, but then also based on similar size, districts that have a local option levy, and different factors like that. So when I took that information into account, the comparison group averaged out at 18.2%. The comparison group low was 13.16%, and the comparison group high is 33.98%. And as you can see, our reserve policy at 12.5%, I think is pretty in alignment with that comparison group average, and then that group low. Obviously, that high is very high, and I didn't talk directly with that district's finance director to see if there was an anomaly in accounting that caused that, but it is pretty high. It's probably one of the higher ones that I've seen. We generally do carry over a fund balance higher than the 12.5%, and that's because we're very aware that costs are increasing a lot quicker than our revenues. And so I think it's important to point out that we're projecting that we will end around 17% this year due to all of the cost saving measures that we've implemented, and even taking into consideration the savings in this year, which has come in at higher than that 12.5%, we're still having to take pretty significant corrective action. Here's a specific example of how this works. So this is an example for 23-24, the current year that we're operating within. And a reason why we generally carry higher than that 12.5%. So you can see the amounts allocated for contingency, rainy day, and unappropriated ending fund balance. You can see the total CSD reserves in the current year are about $11.4 million. We cannot access the unappropriated ending fund balance. That would truly be a reaction to a natural disaster and more of a cash flow issue if we had to cover something in a short period of time. So really the available reserve cash that we have is $6.8 million in the current year. And just for some comparability, I ran our average operating expenses for the months January through April. And in those months, our operating costs are about $11.3 million per month. June is much higher than that, almost probably close to 2 or 3 times that amount. And so what you can hopefully see from this example is our available reserve isn't even enough to cover 1 month of operating costs. Okay. So that is all for the presentation portion. We will hear public comment prior to discussion, so I'll turn it back to you, Chair.
Okay. I was about to suggest the agenda says to ask some clarifying questions of the two of you first, but I think since we have so many people here who I'm sure wish to provide some, we only have 3? Okay, well, let's get them out of the way. So we'll go ahead and do public comment first, if there's no objection to that, and then we can ask questions, staff, and have some discussion. So who's first? Yes. So we will now open it up for public comment. And while we value the lived experiences of students, families, staff, and community, and we do welcome public comment as necessary and important part of the work of the committee, the complete guidelines for public comment were available on the registration table at the back of the gym and are available electronically with the agenda for this meeting. But there are a couple important points that I want to point out. When it is your turn to speak, please come forward, have a seat, and direct your comments to the committee as a whole. Before you start, please state your name for the record and state whether or not you reside within the school district's boundary. You will have 3 minutes to make your comments. You will be alerted when you have 30 seconds left. There's a fancy little timer right there. It'll turn yellow with 30 seconds left. And then from yellow to red at the end of 3 minutes. At that point, I will allow you to finish. If you're not done yet, I will allow you to finish up whatever point you are currently making at that exact moment, but I do request, in order to respect the time of everybody here, that we do try to keep it as close to that 3 minutes as possible. Following your comments, the committee will have 3 minutes to ask clarifying questions of your statement, but we are not able to engage in a conversation. If committee members would like to revisit a topic or issue brought up during public comment, they may do so at the appropriate time in the agenda. Please recall that the role of this committee is different than that of the school board in general. Specifically, we cannot set salaries, benefits, or contract terms, set staffing levels or change the district's organizational structure, make decisions regarding programs or services offered or funded, and make or alter district goals or policies. All of those are the purview of the board itself. Additionally, please note that the proposed budget is balanced, and we are required to have a balanced budget. So if you are commenting in regards to a request for an increase or decrease to budget expenditures, it would be helpful if you could also identifying a corresponding decrease or increase as appropriate. So if you say, for example, I would like us to increase funding to a certain section, please give us an idea of where else we could cut in that stead. So with that said, let us begin.
My name is Amanda Cordes, she, her. I am a resident within the Corvallis School District boundary, and I am also the parent of a first grader in the district, so my family will be directly impacted by the decisions of the board and the district for over a decade to come. I come to the Budget Committee today because other organizations have effectively used tiered pay cuts for leadership or administration to manage budget issues and mitigate the impact on both frontline staff and the populations that are being served. I know OSU has done this before. There are also examples where some of the companies who are most effectively able to weather the Great Recession use this strategy. For example, anyone earning over X takes a 12% pay cut for the current budget cycle. Between X and Y, a 10% pay cut. Between Y and Z, 7.5%, etc. I'm sure you get the idea. The question that I would like the committee to address at the appropriate point in the agenda is, are tiered pay cuts for administration being implemented during this budget cycle? If yes, can you provide additional detail? And if these cuts are not being implemented, can you please explain to the community why? Thank you.
Are there any questions from members of the committee? Therese?
Thank you for sharing. You mentioned that you mentioned OSU, and then you said other. Do you have any other organizations you're aware of besides OSU? Did I miss those?
I didn't list them by name because they are, other non-education-based companies. But for example, if you look in like Harvard Business Review, other places like that have case studies that detail how they were effective and what they did.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Thank you very much. Next up.
Thank you. My name is Nancy Roan, and I do reside in the district, in the school district here. My concerns are that we are losing an art teacher position and a music teacher position. And those of you who know me know that's of great importance because these are the kids that stay in school and graduate. These are the rear ends you need parked in the seats to get your budgeting from the state. So it's important for me to see if the budget committee would review those cuts again. And I'd like the athletic budget to be heavily reviewed because I had reports from kids on sports teams that they were receiving catered lunches from Pastini's, Chipotle's on the days of their home games here. These are the high school teams. And so if their budget is so padded, they can afford to have catered lunches for those specialty groups, then I think the athletics budget needs a little bit more review. And they were not paid for by the Boosters Club, I checked. So please, before you seal this budget for good, please review the athletic budget, and I'm all for sports too, but I don't think we need the perks that have been going on. Thank you.
Before I ask for questions, just for the record, Ms. Roan owns the violin shop here in town, so obviously, music, very important to her, and I did rent a violin from her for some time.
And these are not the kids out in the these are not kids that are making serious problems in our community. Now, the music and arts kids, they're not kids without problems, but they're not the problem kids that require more help from the school district. Thank you.
So are there any questions for Ms. Roan? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I know it's hard decisions.
Okay.
I would have myself previously just to save time. I thought there were 10. Ready? Oh, okay. So I am Patricia Von Glahn. I am a resident of Corvallis. I no longer have students participating in the district. However, I do act as an advocate on behalf of special needs, special challenge students and parents, as well as general community members. My concern in my readings pertaining to the curriculum adoption, which was just passed at the last budget meeting. Upon my reading, ODE does not require a curriculum adoption. We are in drastic states here with funding. I request that the curriculum adoption not go forward, and those funds be used to enhance the academic, social, and emotional needs of all children in the school, K through 12, and there's numerous worldwide research, which I'm sure you're aware of, arts and music and theater do so much for mental health. We can withhold the curriculum and put those fundings into art and music and theater. The kids that I've spoken with in the district, not one of them has told me that curriculum has saved their life. The kids that I speak with in the district privately and during school hours, art saves their life. One child said she thought that scissors were used for cutting herself. After being involved in art, she realizes art is where the scissors belong for creative endeavors. Art touches the souls of our students. Another gentleman that I spoke with said music. Music quiets the madness in his mind. These are powerful statements. And these are the kids who are not in the general cliques. They're on the fringe. We're spending an enormous amount of money on mental health in various forms. From the students would benefit more, in their own words, by increasing art and music. Allocate the funds, redirect the funds. Let's get some concrete help that the students are asking for. I want to second the, not investigation, the review of the athletic department. I am a proponent of athletics. That's how I got to college. However, the ship is sinking. We need to review all the pieces combined to athletics and reallocate the funds. I also agree with the tiered of budgeting. That is an excellent way to look at the budget and to shift some money around. Money belongs in the kids' hands. We need hands on students' desks first to help with their mental health and to keep school. College Hill is wonderful.
I'm going to ask you to please wrap
Yep.
it up really quickly. 'cause
Thank you.
you're over your
College
time.
Hill is wonderful when we take a very in-depth look at why does College Hill succeed? What is it offering the students? Listen to them and replicate what is working in College Hill to save our kids in school. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions from members of the committee? No? Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Just really quickly, I know there's more folk here than testified, and I don't know if folk are here to support, and I heard that comment cards, you all turned some back in, and I just wanted to double check that you all weren't here to testify on budget stuff, just for clarification. And if you were, we welcome your comments, and I wanted to make sure you felt like you can speak what you needed to say related to the budget process. And if that's not the case, then if you had things you wanted to ask of the board, if it was a board question, if you can send that to board@k12.or.us, and we'll all get it at the same time. But if it was about the budget, I just want to make sure that we made space for you since you made the time to come down. I know I'm not running the meeting, but I was a little bit like, there's a lot of you here, so yeah.
Samuel?
So meanwhile, Chair, I have maybe a request or a question to the last speaker, and maybe if I can share it with the last speaker so they can either email it to us or answer it if that's appropriate. You mentioned a request for the budget committee to reconsider allocation for curriculum review, and I'm assuming for future curriculum reviews. So I don't want to ask you on the spot, but if you have any specific line items related to that in the budget, I'd like to encourage you maybe to share that, and I'll be asking staff afterwards to highlight where are we spending in upcoming ones, just to make sure I understand the question was, or the proposal was about upcoming, not about already have been decided on. So just a request or a question. Either way. If you want to speak to the microphone, though, for the record.
Okay, so it's for the recent adoption of the science and the math curriculum, that if we could put that on hold and re-examine it again and allocate the money.
So your proposal.
Because I expected that curriculum to be voted down last time.
Okay. So your proposal for the curriculums that has been approved already, correct?
The one that's approved already, and if there's a new one coming up, we can also reconsider that as well, to reallocate the funds. We are sinking here. New books is not going to save our kids. Teachers in classrooms interact with children. That's the most important place.
Thank you for your answer.
Thanks, Sammy.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Lonnie Sherman, and I reside in the Corvallis School District boundaries. I worked in the Corvallis School District for several years, and then stepped away to pursue my master's in education for elementary education. I have come here today to make sure that I am not just teaching my students to be change makers, to educate themselves on the issues in their community, but to make sure that I'm doing that myself. So while my second graders are singing their little hearts out at their concert tonight at their elementary school, I told them that I would not be there because I would be here fighting for music and art and for them. And to that, these little 7 and 8 year olds stood up and applauded because they understand the importance of it. My question to the board is, to the budget committee and the board at large, is when will we stop talking about the numbers and instead talk about the needs? I hear a lot about the enrollment going down, but I don't hear a lot of statistics based on the needs that are increasing, both in behavior, which I've seen firsthand, mental health crisis, which I've seen firsthand in many schools as I have subbed all over the district this year. Those kind of struggles are increasing, and while there may be, as was said tonight, a smaller ratio of student to teacher ratio, that does not mean that the issues that are happening in the schools have lessened, which means as you continue to cut faculty, the support is not going to be there. So it's academically, with the lack of academic progress, both in our district and across the state, I would hope that the budget committee would take into consideration some of the suggestions that have been brought forth tonight and focus again on the needs of the students, not just the numbers that you see. And if it takes a temporary adjustment to the budget in order to save these staff members and these programs, while the community steps forth to propose these bigger changes having to do with housing, which absolutely there's a housing crisis, to enrollment, that's what I would ask, is that we think of the immediate need now and not be so scared of what might happen with enrollment later and where the funding is going to go, that we cut off the needs that we have immediately. Because by the time we maybe are able to try to bring it back, it'll be too late for many of our students. Thank you.
Any questions from members of the committee? No? All right, thank you. And one last call if there's anyone else who wishes to speak tonight.
One second. I'm Kevin Jones. Microphone is on. Good. I live in the district. I have a student in the district. I sent a letter to the board. I wasn't sure if it would qualify for today, but here we are. Now I just have to pick it up so that I can read it. Hopefully this will be. To the Corvallis School District Board and Committee, Budget Committee. We, the undersigned library professionals at Oregon State University Libraries and Press, in our individual capacity as teachers and facilitators of access to information for residents and students in Corvallis, present this letter in support of the board authorizing the use of district funds designated for the reserve to be redirected toward maintaining library staff levels in the district at 2023-24 levels until the next biennium in order to prevent the loss of library service hours for elementary students in the district during the 24-25 school year. We affirm the findings of decades of research that school library staff have a direct, statistically significant, positive impact on student academic achievement and literacy in K-12 education. We affirm the role of libraries and library staff in increasing equitable access to information, skills, and technology, and creating a safe place for all students. We affirm, like other aspects of the learning process, that the work done in school libraries will have lasting impacts on students and affect our future work at the university level. We affirm that library staff are essential to the function of a school and the success and well-being of its students. We join our library colleagues in the district and community to ask you to support this possible adjustment and encourage district administration to act accordingly. Sincerely, and then me and 14 of my colleagues signed the letter. And it would take too long to read all their names, so I'm not going to. But thank you.
Okay, fair enough. Any questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to take a moment to thank everybody who spoke tonight, particularly for keeping it brief and to the point. That's not always the case in government meetings, so good job and thank you. So at this point then, I will go ahead and close the public comment part of the meeting. But before we get going on asking questions, gonna see if members of the committee would like to take a short recess before we get going in, or do we just want to plow on through? Looks like we're gonna go on through. Okay. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and open it up for discussion between committee members and questions to staff. But before we begin, does any committee member wish to make any disclosures for the record? Okay. Hearing none, then we will open it up for deliberation and questions. Who wants to go first? All right.
You have to kind of hold it for a second.
There we go.
I have a question for clarification, Lauren, and I know this may deal with things that the Budget Committee is not supposed to be talking about, but since it was raised several times, I just needed to clarify it for myself. When I looked at the decreases in PE, music, and art, I believe your explanation was that the decreases were matching the decrease of student enrollment. and that's how the percentages went down. So I guess my question is, are the students getting the same amount of PE, music, and art that they got this year, next year?
So the basis of the allocation is on the number of classrooms in a school. So if the number of classrooms decreases, then the number of, the amount allocated is going to also decrease. So for example, for music, they're currently funded for, each class is funded for 2 periods, or I don't know what we call it in elementary. It's fine. Amy's like, yeah, it's fine. Periods work, okay. So they're funded for 2 classes every week. And so the first thing we do is adjust the formula based on that. So the number of classrooms in our schools went down at almost all of the elementary schools, as you saw by that information. That's the first. So yes, we saw a decrease in staffing, in music, and PE, but we did not, it wasn't because we reduced the services to students in those areas. Art is separate of that. We did change the formula this year as a cost-saving measure. So that's why disproportionately, when those, when you look at those allocations, the art looks different. So we did change the formula for art. Yes, instead of receiving the services twice a week, it's once per week, per classroom. And that's specific to the elementary schools. So we made no changes to the allocation at the high school or the middle school level, because we do not allocate to schools in that same methodology. So that's up to the principals to build their schedule based on forecasting information. And so there were decreases in those classes as they were prioritizing classes based on requirements as well as what was forecasted by students.
Next, Lou.
Since you explained how that worked for the art classes, can you explain how that worked for like music and library media a little bit more clearly for folk, in case, because it's just like, it's not just a number, they're people, right, that we've been hearing from. And so like, when you explained it right now, it's talked about how the services change with the staffing changes and stuff like that. How did that work for the access to music in library? I know we heard a little bit from staff that have testified, but I think it would be helpful if we clarified like the process a little bit for folks.
So we have to talk about it in the elementary enrichment. If we're talking about that, that's a different way if we're talking about it at the secondary levels. But for music, there wasn't any change to the number of minutes that a student will receive from this year to next year in music, if we're talking about K-5. The library media is the funding for that. We changed how we allocated that. So what we looked at before, we looked at several different methodologies, and then we tried to spread that out based on the number of classrooms and students at a school, similar to how we do for elementary enrichment, which is PE, music, and art. So we looked at the number of classrooms in a school, and we determined, and I don't remember the formula that we used as far as minutes go off the top of my head, but I can look and get back to you. But we looked at the number of minutes the students per class would be in the library each week. And then we added on top of that some prep time for the LMTs to do additional work, because not all of their work is not in front of students. Like there's a lot of back end work and administrative work that goes in to keeping those libraries running. So we allocated per classroom on that as well. So like for example, if you look at Mountain View, who may have less students, their library media tech is going to have less FTE because they are seeing less classrooms per week.
Thanks.
Thank you. So following up on that, it just dawned on me, having subbed in the grade schools, elementary schools, that is where the classroom teachers get some of their prep time. when their groups go out to those specialists. And so if those specialists are being cut, have you guys considered how that's going to impact the elementary school's planning time?
Teachers will still have the allocated amount of planning time in the contract, so that hasn't been a concern in that.
Teachers, they have a dedicated prep time specifically before the school day starts in elementary. Those times when students are gone to specials is time for them, yes, but their dedicated time that is guaranteed by contract still exists before the school day.
So you, I think the question about the music for elementary, I think I understand. What's the impact of music offerings at the middle and high school level? Are there changes happening there?
Secondary, it is still enrollment based, based on those projections. So the principals made individual school decisions based on what their students have forecasted. So if less students were forecasted for music classes, then that was an area where they felt like they could reduce some FTE. All schools were expected to reduce FTE based on enrollment projections, and it's a little bit different at that secondary level, just based on the students are going from class to class all day long versus like having their home classroom.
So in that same formula of based on the forecasting, were there other elective sections particularly related to what we would consider to be CTE courses? Did any of those see reductions in any of the high schools?
I don't
see it in here, so I was just asking.
I can't remember that one off the top of my head. We will take that as a question, and we will bring it back to you next time for sure.
I have a question about music at the high school levels. So are the music classes available at both high schools? Are students being required to travel to the other high school to participate in music? Because I think that would impact forecasting if students are being asked to do that.
Are you asking if the same exact course is offered at both, or just music in general, like a music class?
Is the orchestra like a combined orchestra? I mean, this is just my example, where the students come together at one school, or would orchestra be available at each high school?
So I need to check to see how they were going to do that this year, but they were trying to do some sharing of where the combo orchestra course was going to be held in order to make it fair for students who have to travel, because they do have to travel. That's one of the ways that we ensure that our kids can get the things that they want, the classes that they want, if it's not offered in their high school. So I can check with the high school principals and see how they scheduled those orchestra sections, but I know there was supposed to be some kind of a balance between the two schools.
And that's something that, from my understanding, changes year to year anyway, depending on the students who are forecasting those classes.
I just think as a student who is faced with having to travel for a class may opt not to request that class for the upcoming year, which would then, because of limited resources, impact, it's sort of a false impression of what the demand would be if it were available without traveling.
And at the same time, I appreciate the work that both high school principals have done to try to create offerings that kids can do across schools. They've worked really collegially around that to make sure that there are options for kids with the bus going back and forth between periods. So yes, I agree with you, and they've worked really hard to make sure that they continue to provide offerings, and that's one way of doing it.
I just wanted to know, I thought I just heard you say, but does the district provide the transportation so that everyone can access that? Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Shauna has it now. I'll just say the comment follow-up, and then you can ask a question, because I already asked them. But it was just a observation of, like, it kind of reminds me of some of the challenges that College Hill faces, as far as, like, they have the option, but it doesn't necessarily come into reality for some of the things they don't have at College Hill. So your comment just kind of reminded me of that. That's all I was, but my other questions are unrelated, so I'm going to give it over to Shauna first.
Thanks, Lou. And I know the choirs at the high school level are combined at one school, also as one to go back and forth, just as an example. Just in terms of follow-up, I know Lauren, thank you so much for your detailed and thoughtful responses to all of our questions, and just to continue the probing, I think, for the community as well, just in transparency as we're understanding impact. With library, you talked about the impact at the elementary level. Could you talk a little bit more about access to libraries and how that would be impacted for middle schoolers and high schoolers, given what's proposed?
There wasn't any change at that level. So there's no change in library service level at the middle school or high schools.
So I would like to ask a couple of questions, probably for the record later. The shortfall of 8.5 or 8.3, sorry, $8.2 million. How does that translate to a difference in the state's allocation to the state school fund from what we have now as 10.2 billion for the biennium? What is the in excess of 10.2 billion that would have bridged that shortfall? If we're going to think about the shortfall equitably with other school districts per ADMW.
Are you talking about if the state if they would have allocated additional funds over 10.2?
Correct. What would that additional fund translate to? And now on the spot, maybe for later on.
I would have to look into it. To be honest, it's been a while since we were looking at the last biennial allocation and what we thought was fully funded for QEM, because that ship has kind of sailed, and we're working on that now for the next biennium, where costs increase again. So I can look at that for you. We do, just as a reminder, state school fund is allocated in this biennium. They like to change it, but it's allocated on a 49-51 split. So we receive 51% of the total allocation in the second year of this biennium, which helps to alleviate some of those cost increases that we know happen year over year, but it's not enough to keep up, clearly.
Thank you. And just to clarify, this is really good clarification that the $8.2 million for our school district for this upcoming budgetary year is a shortfall from what we would have needed for our current service level, not for QEM, correct?
Correct.
Right. Thank you. The second question is related to this shortfall. We're making very difficult decisions. I would like just to ask for an overview of what are we prioritizing most and what are we having to let go of when we're adopting this budget. So maybe reflecting on our goals or reflecting on our priorities. What is the most important thing that we should not let go of? That we embraced in this budget?
We have prioritized class size as one of those pieces that we've really worked hard to maintain. We have had to make a slight adjustment in class size, but that's been a priority for us. We know that students coming out of the pandemic have had more significant needs, as you've heard tonight. And so that's an area that we continue to look at and try our best to address. We looked at changes to class size at middle school and high school, and it was too deep of a cut, and so we didn't go there. So that's probably the area we have focused on the most. We have also done as much as we can away from classrooms. So as the example tonight, the department cuts being at near twice that at as at the school level. We have really reduced our district office staff to really a bare bones district office, while we still have nearly 200 reports per year to submit to the federal government and the state, and audits. We have really worked hard to make reductions there, so as far away from classrooms as possible. So those are some of the examples of things we've made priorities around. One of the other priorities we've made is we've made no reductions in the area of special education. That was, for me, an area that I was opposed to making reductions in, and so we've made no reductions in that area.
Thank you. Is there, with that prioritization, we're still seeing cuts closer to the classroom just because of the impact of the cuts?
You can't cut $8.2 million from a district office.
Yeah, thank you. Similarly, is class size flat, or we minimize the increase in class size?
Minimized it at the elementary.
Thank you.
Flat at middle and high.
Okay, my turn for a question. So I'm looking back at the number of staff that is being cut, and cutting 51 school positions saves only $200,000. So less than $4,000 per year per FTE that's eliminated. We're paying our teachers more than $4,000 a year, right? And then while we cut 14 district positions, which saves $3 million, which is over $200,000 saved per district position, to me that math just isn't mathing.
Sure, because that includes a lot more than just salaries and benefits in those numbers. So the number, the budgeted amount, the dollar allocated to schools is not just staffing. There's a lot of other components to that as well. So that's why you're seeing that. So the district office, for example, we cut the 14 FTE, but we also reduced almost every single contract that we could that was additional. For example, our facilities and maintenance department cut over $1 million in projects, so we will be responsive only. We will not be doing anything additional. So that dollar amount is not directly attached to the staff. Does that make more sense?
On the district end, yeah, but I guess I just don't see how cutting 51 FTE from schools only saves $200,000.
Sure. So every year, obviously our contracts have a built-in cost increase to those, and so every year, say for example, the cost of living increase or COLA is 5%. The effective cost to the district is not 5%. There's also steps built into there. The step increases, those percents are different for each bargaining agreement, and I don't have those numbers memorized. Yeah, so it's around that 3.5%. So the effective increase just in salary on a step plus COLA is actually closer to 8 or 9% for those employees. So I think a big difference in the public sector versus private, when you're looking at the expense of a salary, is we have a 34% cost associated with our salaries, and over 2/3 of that is related to the public employee retirement system. And so that's a major expense. So for every dollar, 34 cents goes towards our employees' retirement package with the state. So that's pretty significant. So as the salary increases, it's a percentage, so that cost also increases. We didn't change how we allocate funds to schools as far as their own building discretionary allocations, so those stayed stable. We didn't cut any funds there. And so that's largely why we're not cutting like curriculum things that are going to the school, a lot of the services. So a lot of the conversation has been, well, for example, our SG&E department has a lot of staff that they fund through their budget, but they actually serve directly in schools with students. And so I know that there were reductions there because like Ryan said, there's no way to cut just $8.2 million from our total district budget. It just wouldn't be possible. And so we really have preserved the services directly impacting students as much as we could. And we say that, and that's not meaning that we know that there aren't impacts to that experience, but we tried our best to keep it as far away as possible.
Thank you. Any others?
Thanks for that. And I just wanted to say, like, I recognize that the people we're talking about in the district office are people too, and they have lives attached to their salaries too, just like all the other ones. And so I can't imagine that that's difficult across the board between district office and teaching in student-facing positions and behind-the-scenes staff. Like every single one of those aren't just numbers to me. Those are like people as part of our community, and so it's really difficult to have to sit with that. I have a question. I just wanted to ask the question that one of our commenters asked about the tiered cuts and if that was looked at, and I have another question after that.
So in 2021, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had all non-represented employees, so all of our administrators take a pay freeze for that year. We didn't ask that of either of our other groups, our teachers or our classified groups. So in my mind, we are still trying to make up that ground for that group of people, and so that had not been a decision that we made for this year, but it is a decision we made in the past when, again, we didn't know. It was early in the pandemic. It was that June, and we weren't sure what the allocations were going to look like and our ability to fund schools, and so we made that decision at that point in time for that group specifically.
Thank you, that makes sense. And then there was a couple of questions about the curriculum adoption, and I was wondering about the implications of not like funding and adopting new curriculums. I'm thinking about the asks of the community that has come in as far as like supporting math, for example, and like and preparing students, and as well as like the mandated curriculum set or requirements from the state that are coming up. So if we're not adopting curriculum, like if for some reason we wanted to go back on our decision or something, what would the implications be to the district?
I think there'd be a couple of implications. The first would be the amount of time staff have put into making decisions about curriculum, and piloting materials would be something where I would make an assumption that people would feel burnt by that in some ways. One of the other implications would be materials have been purchased, so what would be the cost of restocking? The other area that I think a lot about is that as curriculum adoptions were happening, and as the coordinators came and presented to you, there were decisions that were made, as an example, elementary science, not to do an adoption because all year we've been talking about the financial implications of all decisions we've made. We have had a hiring freeze all year. So anytime anyone was hired this year, a decision had to be made by the executive team whether or not to post that job. So throughout our system, people know that funds and resources have been really tight, and they've been trying to make decisions based on that, where they really need the materials and where they can get by. We heard that with some of the high school materials too. Some of those analogies didn't look, or the large text didn't look much different than they had in the past. So we put those on hold. And so those decisions, I think, again, I would say 3 examples. Folks put in the time. We've made some purchases already. and staff made clear decisions, understanding the challenges we were facing.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate that. I think it's helpful for if folks weren't listening to that meeting that they knew that there was a decision made to not adopt it, and that was taken into consideration too. It was a significant savings. I remember it was a lot of money that was saved by not adopting that specific curriculum, and curriculum does get dated, and I know that feeling supported for students to see themselves reflected in curriculum also helps keep them feeling safe in schools too. The last question is about the implications of lowering reserves. Like, what would the long-term implications of lowering reserve look like? I don't know if we should ask that question here though, or is that a question for here, or is that a question for another meeting?
You can discuss and ask questions about it.
Okay,
It's not
yeah.
a decision that this group can make.
Yeah, I think because it came up about, didn't that come up in our questions, or was that me writing? Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, so it was the implications if we lowered reserves to the district, I guess is the question. I'm
Sure.
trying to help folk with their clarity with their questions.
So I'll talk about the policy side of it, and I'll let you talk about the financial implications. So on the policy side, the board would need to make a modification to that policy. And so that would take action of the board. Typically, board, because it's policy DA, they would do a first and second reading. There are instances where they make a decision at a first reading to make a modification. My concern would be not just changing that amount, but the requirement for me to put together a plan to fill those coffers back up in 3 years, recognizing that we are going to be having the same conversation, I predict, for the next 4 years as we look at enrollment. This is not a one-year problem. This is a 5-year problem. And so I don't know how I would be able to backfill those reserves in the next 3 years, which is the requirement of the policy. So that's the policy implications, and you can talk more about the financial implications.
On the financial side of things, from the example where I used the 23-24 numbers, as you can see, it was a little over $6 million that we would truly have access to if we access that full amount, everything except for the unappropriated. So that amount doesn't solve our problems. If you look at the numbers, like if you look at the corrective action required of 8.2 and that reserve, if we completely depleted the reserves, that would be just over $6 million. So in the current year, it doesn't fix the problem. In future years, as you can see by a lot of, hopefully was clear just as our comparisons year over year, is the biggest problem is our expenses are rapidly outpacing our revenues. And so if we are going to be required to refill those reserves back up to the level within 3 years, and we know the revenues are coming in at a lot lower rate than the expenses are increasing, that just puts us in a position to cut even deeper year over year. And from my personal opinion, I think we would be digging a bigger hole for ourselves. And that becomes, I think an important part, which I've read that policy so many times, and something I didn't pull out of it was the part where it says specifically budget stability, I think is the term that it specifically uses. And I don't believe if we access the reserves, we will be having that budget stability. I think we will actually be creating more volatility.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, I think Chris had a question first.
Thank you. You kind of answered some of the question about the reserves, but on the policy part of that, when was that? Has that been reviewed and recently, or when was that?
We review that policy annually, and this year I think we've done it twice. Once in winter, and then there was a request made by you, Chris, to review the policy several months ago. So that policy has been reviewed by this board twice in the last 12 months.
I just want to remind us of that. And then also on the tiered payouts for administrative. I think the other thing to consider is that our administration works longer months in time than our staff that work in the schools, and that, so if we are going to look at that, we need to consider that as well. And also our administrative pay per hour, looking at that compared to some of our higher paid teachers, I think is similar. So yeah, I just want us to think about those things while we're talking about this as well.
For our middle school assistant principals and our higher paid teachers on the pay scale, their hourly rate is very similar.
Yeah, thank you.
A couple follow-up questions, comments related to the discussion around the pay and the reserve, but I'll start with the reserve. So just for the reserve policy, the policy is written right now to, through these three different buckets, have a 12.5% reserve. The question about budget stability, I guess you made a comment that you thought that if we changed the policy, if we used reserves, that we would be creating a bigger hole for ourselves. So I want to throw out poverty economics here for just a second, because when you don't have money to plan long term, you don't think about what is going to happen years down the road. You think about what needs to be addressed right now with what you have to work with. And so I think one of the challenges that many of our community members are communicating, the challenge a little bit that I am struggling with too, is that we don't have enough money to provide what we have determined in many ways to be essential services to our students. Holding on to money for a down the road scenario where we also may not have enough money to meet essential services. But what has failed to be clear is at what point would we actually think that it is in our best interest to spend our reserves? Because so far all the communication has been, it's not a good idea to spend the reserves. So a question, this is not a question I am actually asking you to answer right now. Maybe you have an answer, but it's more for us to just be wondering is, what is the scenario in which we say, no, these services are so essential that we actually will use our reserves even though we don't know how we would put them back? Because I've not seen that yet, so I don't know what that looks like, and I think it would be really helpful to have that as a contrast.
Can I answer it?
Oh, sure, if you have an answer.
Well, I have a partial answer.
Okay.
So when we've had those discussions about that policy over the years, I have asked for the same thing, for the board to give those examples to me, because that would also help me. And we have not, the board has not given specific examples that are clearly defined, and that's why it's a board policy and a decision that the board would be have to make on the behalf of the district. Sammy has a question about that, but
okay.
Therese, do you want to keep going?
Well,
Well, you're the chair, so I
yeah,
stopped.
I mean, okay, yes, thank you. So that makes sense, and I think that this speaks to that having looked at the policy as opposed to having evaluated if the policy continues to be in our best interest may not be the same thing. I think that we do need to evaluate if the policy as it's written is in our best interest given our economic circumstances. With regard to some of the services, I totally hear that the $6 million, it would not cover the gap, right? The gap is bigger than that. So it doesn't make sense to drain all of our reserves and still not plug the gap. We would still have to make cuts. So I don't think there's any question about, at least in my mind, there's no question about that we cannot not make cuts, right? The question is, when we're talking about long-term strategy, what I don't see and what I'm not hearing right now is what is our long-term strategy for our declining enrollment around that we don't have a sustainable budget. So I guess I'm pushing back a little bit on the question of whether or not using reserves would make us, would leave us in a situation that's less sustainable. Because in reality, what we don't have right in front of us right now, and what we've not really done the work to talk about yet, is if the numbers keep dropping as they're dropping, it's more than just 51 FTE or a pay freeze. That's not going to save us. We are talking about major major restructuring that would need to happen if we really get down to 5,000 students in our district. And for just for clarification for the community, you know, we're not allowed to like recruit for, you know, we can't, as a school system, we can't go out and be like, let's try to get kids from other districts to come over here. We're not allowed to do that. So we have to work with making Corvallis a community that can receive more people that have children. And I think that got mentioned it's been mentioned many times, and I know that sentiment is held by a lot of people who unfortunately do not control the housing situation in Corvallis. So what I think I'm hoping for in this is not, will we use the reserves to resolve our immediate situation? It's, we're gonna have the same conversation in 2 years. The cuts that we are making right now, they are not enough to keep us out of trouble if enrollment continues to decline. The cuts we are making right now are enough to hurt our immediate delivery of services. And I am wondering about whether or not there is a better practice of not making our academic and student experience whole bigger while we figure out the budget situation. And I think that that's what I am fearing is going to happen with some of the targeted cuts, that will be the end result, particularly around mental health and around library. And I would say, I guess I'm still trying to make sense of the art and music change, because I think I might have had conflicting information about that before this evening. But certainly with mental health and with library, we are talking about losing people who are carrying a good amount of work. And as I loved the term force multipliers for the library staff that came up in the last, public comment. So I don't know, I don't have a question. I guess I have a question, and my question is, what the heck are we gonna do in 2 years? We won't be able to make enough cuts to keep all of our buildings open. We won't be able to make enough cuts to keep all of our services intact, but we're holding on to reserves that won't save us in 2 years either. So I would really encourage us to think about if there is some way that we can access some of those reserves and slow the deficit of our student experiences while we figure out a longer term solution if Salem doesn't get their act together, which I don't know that I don't think we can rely on them to do that. But while we're still hoping that they're going to do that, we are in a situation where I think the term that the ship was sinking was used. The ship is sinking, and we're like, we don't want to put people in the lifeboats, because what if it goes down a little bit deeper? But then, like, we're going to reach a point where the lifeboats won't help us. And I just wonder, I feel like we may be at that tipping point on that, and I think we need to have more conversation about this.
Can I add something to that? And it's not, I know there's a lot of conversations that need to be happening at the board leadership level as far as what that looks like long term. I just want to give the perspective from my seat as on the finance side, and our reserves, and the part that I am most concerned about, that I would not have thought I would have been concerned about even a year or two ago, was making sure that we pay all of our employees at the end of the year. That is a real thing that is happening in districts where they are borrowing and using tax anticipation notes because this situation is so extreme that they can't fulfill their contracts at the end of the year. So when I show you that reserve amount of, our over, like we have over $6 million that we could access in a year if we needed to, and we know our monthly operating costs are $11 million, and in June, that's almost 3 times as much. Yeah, so Ryan asked to explain why it's more expensive, and that is because the way that our contracts work, we pay our non-260 staff what we call balance of contract. So in June, they receive their pay for June, July, and August, so it's a almost triple payroll in that regard. And a lot of, contract renewals and closeouts happen at that time too. So it's just a high cost time. But that's the real concern. I think that we are wanting to make sure that that's not us, and that we are being responsible to our staff that we currently employ, and honor the contracts that we have signed with many community partners, and make sure that from a fiscal responsibility standpoint, that we can honor the obligations that we have made. And yes, that is a short-term concern. I 100% agree with you on that. I have a hard time making those two things dependent on each other. I'm still not confident that that's the short-term fix, although it's not my decision to make. That's just my perspective from the finance director role. And I 100% agree that we have a long-term problem that we need to be working on a plan. I also just want to be clear that we do project financials for out 3 to 5 years, and depending on what level of detail. So I don't want people to think that we're just looking at 1 year at a time. We have projections, which is why we know what we're up against. And we will need to look at additional solutions to those problems.
Thank you for providing that clarification around the budget. And I guess I want to make sure that I'm very clear that I think you guys do an amazing job with limited resources. You make really hard decisions. You make way harder decisions than we have to make. And this is really important. The community doesn't maybe always know how policy, the relationship between policy and practice happens, but that policy that you are following because we gave you that policy, and we have not changed that policy. So you are doing on paper exactly what the board told you to do. So this is not a district administration issue, community. This is not the district saying we're unwilling to do this. This is the policy says they need to do this, and the board is responsible to create policy. So this is a joint effort it will take from both sides to be able, so I want to make sure people are clear about that. But I also think that if we had changed that policy to say 4% is the minimum that you need to hold, you would be using that other 1%. And so maybe we have done a disservice to not have already taken action and reduced that and given you that ability to do that. Because I can't imagine that you wouldn't be using every penny that you believed you had available to you. And so that policy is binding up those dollars, and we can no longer afford not to reevaluate if that policy is in the best interest. I want to be really clear that the community does not hear me saying the superintendent is not trying to figure out how to use every penny that we have, because that is not true. And I don't think that our financial officers are, they are advising us with the policies they're responsible for to come up with something that they think they can actually achieve. So it is not a criticism that this is where the numbers are landing of the specific administration. It is a pickle that we are in, that we have a policy and we have not maybe done the heavy thinking work that this board is very good at doing to evaluate if the policy is serving us the way it did when we originally wrote it. And I want to take responsibility as a board member for that and say, we need to have a conversation about that. Then if you don't want to use it, we can have a conversation about how you don't want to use resources. But we can't have that conversation in that way right now because we've not given you the access to that in a very clear, definitive way. And that is 100% policy is the board's responsibility.
As long as it's really quick, yes.
It is super quick. It's that I want to make sure that the community knows that the soonest we would even be able to change that policy is August. And so I want to make sure that people know, like, we can't just change it right now or even at our next meeting because we don't have that kind of operating time. And so I just want to make sure I 100% agree with you, Therese, but I think it's really important that people understand the way that we do first and second reads and all, and we get comment from the community to engage with you all. There's just zero, like for this budget cycle, if you're not hearing us bring it up, that is part of why it is timeline related. And so just wanted to make sure y'all, I'm not trying to like skirt any kind of responsibility of reviewing a policy. I just want it to be clear the kind of timeline that we need to use. And so it would be the soonest we can even change it would be August.
Okay, well, Sammy had a question, and then I think I saw Tish had her hands up too, then we'll get to you. So Sammy first.
So probably I'll save some comments to the deliberation part, but I want to highlight a couple of things here that I heard. To quote a fellow board member from another district, larger district, he said, what we're seeing now is terrible in this year for their district, next year is catastrophic, in his words. Do you feel we're trending that way? Or are we trending that way as well?
I think what I've seen statewide is we are in a, I know it might not feel like this at this moment, we are in a lot better position than most to handle what's going on because we do make long-term plans and we are very clear about the parameters that we work within, whether that be the board policy like Therese mentioned, or you know, how the state school fund works and how we're allocated funding. So I'm not saying that we don't anticipate additional reductions, but what we know is that we are prepared to do that work, and we know that it's coming. Unfortunately, there's a lot of districts in the current state that have no idea what's coming, and they have not, they don't have the runway that we have given ourselves, and I want to be very clear that I'm not taking credit for that. I stepped into this role in December, so we've had many years of, I think, really good financial planning and success due to the work of many people, the board included. So hard, yes. Catastrophic is not a word that I would apply to our specific issue at Corvallis School District.
But it's going to be worse if the revenue continues the way it's trending, the expenses continue the way that they're trending, the housing crisis and enrollment continue the way it's trending. It's going to get worse disproportionately. Or is it going to continue flat? Are we going to stay where we are, or are we going to cut more? If you would have all these assumptions fixed.
There's a lot of assumptions there, Sammy. I think the biggest one is that we don't know for the next year is the state funding. So depending what happens there, that will change things. But again, yes, I don't think that we're in a scenario where our revenues are keeping up with our expenditures, and I don't believe that that's changing. But we are working on a plan, and I'm sure we'll be in lots more conversations about what that plan is.
And all of our balance in excess of the board required policy for reserves is being allocated for, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thanks.
Beat a dead horse, but I want to revisit the textbooks because you said a couple things that I need a little bit of clarification on. So I believe
Sure.
you said that some of the textbooks that will be adopted have already been purchased,
Ordered.
ordered. So that will come out of the money. In a sense, we've encumbered already some of that textbook money.
In this year's budget. Not
Oh,
the
in
bu-
this
not
year's
the,
budget.
Not in the,
Not in the 24-25.
they are supposed to be here by the end of June 30, so that it's in the current year budget. It's not in the budget you're working to adopt.
Perfect. So I guess my question is there some play with that money? Or is there some play with that money? Is that budget figure a little bit padded if some of those books are already going to be purchased this year?
In the current year, you're talking about the curriculum?
No, I'm talking about 24-25 budget, the
Okay.
amount that's been allocated for textbooks. If some of that if some textbooks have already been purchased, ordered, and will be paid for this year, is there some money to play with that's already been budgeted?
Instructional materials budget that you're referring to isn't just textbooks. A lot of it are annual subscriptions to curriculum we've already adopted many years ago, so we have to keep up on that. I'm thinking about social studies especially. So it's not all the textbooks. I also want to, for lack of a better term, shout out our principals who in this budget year with their excess discretionary that they had before the end of the year gave money to our department in order to purchase the textbooks that we're looking to buy for next year. So we were incredibly creative in trying to get what we needed so our kids had the textbooks that we were talking about.
So the answer was no. Okay, the other thing that you mentioned, Mr. Superintendent, was that the teachers have put in a great deal of time in choosing the books and in looking at the adoption. And having gone through that process myself, I would agree. However, I wonder if the teachers at the time they were looking to adopt books knew they were facing an $8 million shortfall. Because if they weren't, I know as a teacher myself, if you came back to me now and said, hey, I know you spent a lot of time choosing these books, but like we're not in a good place financially, I would say, well then great, hold off on buying that book.
That's a question I'd have to get answers to.
So our coordinator staff who were running a lot of those adoptions, those questions of our teachers, they were well aware of what was happening, and those questions were, and I'm trying to think, I'm looking at Amy because I know the question was something like, is it something we absolutely need? Would it make a difference if we adopted? Can we hold off? Are we okay with what we have? Knowing what was happening, our teachers at that point, for those questions, yes. Prior to that with, piloting materials, maybe not, but those questions were asked prior to making decisions.
Thank you. And I also see that there's been an increase in $1 million in the consumables budget. Is that necessary?
So are you talking about a specific line item or just on the general rolled up funds page? I want to make sure that I'm speaking to exactly what page you're looking at.
I don't remember, I didn't write it down. I think it was on a page that I had asked you a
I've got it
question
here,
about.
it's page 60.
It's page 60, okay. So,
The consumables line, it looks like about $500,000.
yeah. So the consumables budget, yes, there's a significant increase. A lot of our consumables are things that keep our buildings operated, like toilet paper, like basic things like that. There's not a ton of consumables, I would say, that are being purchased, like paper and things like that. We've really cut down on all of that as a lot of more things are digital. What I would also say about that is when we were going through this budget process, knowing that it was super difficult, principals, they have their discretionary budgets, and at the high school levels, that's a pretty sizable amount, and they weren't sure how kind of all the pieces were going to fall together with staffing and where they may need to use some of their discretionary funds to add another period of FTE to one of their teachers, or if they were going to fund, like keep a staff member and fund them out of their discretionary. So we did put the amount of money that they were using to make those decisions, which I anticipate, I mean, they're working through some of those now, and some of those won't be made sort of last minute until like August, September time to see what students show up and what needs they might have, or different pieces like that. So they did keep some of that money that they're waiting to see how to best support their building in that consumables bucket, because it's just the easiest one to put it in. So there is a little bit of padding there for those things, because they had to have their budget work done to me in March in order to get this all done. There's a lot of other things that have changed and happened since then, so it's sort of their figure out in the fall how they're going to address their building specific needs. So that's a portion of it, but yes, we do see a very significant increase in things to serve our buildings and to keep them open.
And sorry to monopolize, but the professional development activities for teachers and staff has also increased. And I wondered if that was essential.
Can you reference your page number, which specific graph you're looking at?
I'm the reason I'm looking puzzled is because I hammered that entire budget out of growth and experience, so I don't know where that's reflected in the budget, so I'd like to see that.
I'll look for it and get back to you.
Okay.
And my last comment that I just wanted to make was about using the reserves. And I would be really hesitant to use very much of the reserves, because it's not going to, A, it won't bail us out, and B, it just puts us in a deeper hole next year because we have to make up that money, and we won't have that money available to continue the services that we're paying out of that if we choose to do that for 1 year. So, thank you.
All right, real quick, Tony, did you have multiple questions or just one? Multiple? Okay, so suggest maybe we take like a 5-minute recess real quick, and then when we come back, we'll get to you guys. So it's 8:21 right now, so come back at 8:26. Yeah, let's make it 10, sorry. So 8:32. All right, so that brings us back, and I think we were going to start with Tony.
Thank you. So I want to make a quick comment. As I've talked about and was asking questions about the rainy day funds and what, I really appreciate, Lauren, the work in identifying. I didn't intend to advocate for that, and I'm not now by bringing it back up. But I think that information is super helpful for the community conversations, the stakeholders that are in the classrooms that ask those things, and to be honest, some of the negotiating, bargaining units that talk from the region to region, that they talk about these things. So it's super helpful. I think it was last week's school board meeting I watched online when Superintendent Noss was talking about, are we going to be like Ashland, or are we like Bend? Those comparative statements, I think, are worthwhile. So I would ask, though, that when you talked about the comparison districts from the work that you did, if you'd add the names of those districts, that's going to be even more helpful, I think, for the people I talk to that are saying, why aren't we tapping in? And I think I'm comfortable saying I don't think we should, and we need to yet.
Just to clarify on what you're asking for, are you asking me to pull in information from Ashland and Bend in there, or to just name the districts that we used in that comparison?
Yeah, the districts that you used in that information.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. And so when Andrew invited people speaking, the community speaking, and asking if you want to support something, where would you want it to come from? I'm not so sure I'm totally comfortable with that, but I'm wondering as a committee if we will have those conversations. I appreciate looking line item at things that we want to ask questions about, but I don't know if that, Andrew, is part of this committee that we would hazard into that area of this is how we could maybe get more music and art back into grade schools if you consider some other areas. I'm just wondering if that's part of the game here.
Sorry, can you repeat that question? Just make sure I understand it right.
So when people were talking about, hey, we really want to support librarians or music or art, but why don't we take a look at a couple of them talk about athletics. I kind of flinch at that in that process. But as a committee, are we going to engage in that where, like, probably offline, this is where I think we could maybe save some art and music in elementary if you consider taking it from fill in the blank. Is that part of our charge?
Can I answer that?
Sure.
So no, that's not a part. The budget committee does not set staffing levels or funding levels for programs. Your main charge is to look at the budget assumptions, how the information in this document, to assess whether the district applied the parameters that we are given in an accurate way, and to approve the levy amounts, which we will get to, that basically confirms that revenue that we can bring in for our local sources and our tax rate. So no, you don't get to decide programmatic funding levels. That's really something that happens at the district level. Another piece of that is really just to understand, and it's noted in here, I don't know if they're flip through the pages right now, but our board goals are really important in this work. So we just adopted board goals 2 months ago. Now, I don't know. It all goes together. Recently, we adopted board goals, and another role of the budget committee would be to say, we believe that this budget that you put together is in support of your goals and the work that you're doing there.
Okay, thank you, fair enough. So last thing is asking questions that can't get answered for this budget cycle, but we're talking about, do we need to start thinking about closing schools, some more significant, drastic things, but I'd want to I wouldn't want to challenge why our student enrollment is declining, but I want to ask, can we address the things that we have maybe a little bit more control over? I know Superintendent Noss is going to go to Salem, or we're going to advocate for Salem formula to buck up, but I do think we have better control over the kids that are in our district that aren't attending our schools. And I'm talking about anybody aged 5 through 18 that lives in our boundary, but they're not in our schools. Let's find out about that. That's a meta question, but can we talk to ESD about the homeschoolers? Can we talk to Philomath how many students are of ours that are over there? Because I don't think they are facing a student enrollment decline to the level Corvallis district is. So all of the questions that kind of come under that question of not only where and why people are leaving our school district, but what can we do about it? Because that I feel like we have more control over than Salem. I taught social studies for a long time. I think we have a whole lot more control over keeping our families happy than changing, moving the legislature's cheese, right?
Thanks for all that. One thing I will say is I can speak to the Philomath piece in particular because I've had multiple conversations with their superintendent, and they are seeing an increase in enrollment, and that is the students who went to homeschool during the pandemic who are now beginning to come back. It's not an increase of kids from Corvallis. We had a conversation at one point, and she said, "I think I'm getting more of your students." I said, "That's not what I'm seeing in the transfers." And so she went back and looked and confirmed, "Yeah, you're right, and this is where they're coming from." So I have that specific example I can speak to. We do have, last we looked, and this data is pretty loose in terms of the number of homeschoolers, as Jen could attest, but we think we probably have maybe 50 to 60 more homeschoolers now than pre-pandemic, and that is a number that we're paying attention to. Yeah, and I am planning to do work in Salem.
Penny? Loud.
I'll borrow Pinky Sammy. Okay. I wanted to speak about something that's in the budget message, and I know is a longstanding issue and looking ahead a big issue as well, and that's also declining enrollment and the housing crisis in Corvallis. I served on the city council in Corvallis for 6 years and another 2 years on the planning commission. I sat through lots and lots of land use hearings. And I heard so many people coming to speak against housing projects that had been proposed. Rarely did I hear anybody speaking for it, except maybe the property owner, their hired architect or planner. But there is something that people can do. People really can. Andrew happens to be somebody who does speak up about that issue. People can speak up about why we want that new apartment development. There are 2 new big ones opening. Well, there's one in the process of move-in right now on Country Club, and there are a couple in Southtown that will be opening, inhabited in a few months in the fall, because of significant policy changes that have happened first at the state level and then requiring, and so of course Corvallis is accommodating that, changes in our land development code that make it easier to develop middle housing, affordable housing. But there is still the issue that people show up and talk against them. And if you're concerned about this issue, you ought to go to a land use hearing once in a while and figure out how to speak at one, how to speak for housing instead of letting your neighbors just speak against it. If it's really an issue for you, there is something that can be done. I happen to serve on the housing committee of the League of Women Voters. We look at issues around homelessness, affordable housing, workforce housing. There are groups that do that advocate with council, with staff, with our legislators, with Benton County officials. There are things that can be done. No, the school board doesn't affect directly policy, but you influence it. And I know that Ryan also works with a few other CEOs of organizations in Corvallis to talk about workforce housing, because I'm sort of peripherally involved in that. And so it is a big structural issue for the school district that doesn't have to just be a worry. It can also be something where some actions can be taken. Thanks.
I really appreciate you saying that. And that is, I've had feedback since I have started speaking to this from folks who are trying to do the work and appreciating the fact that we're bringing it to the forefront. And I think it's a conversation that as a whole community we need to have, because again, we're going to have to decide. The school district is impacted directly by those decisions, and I think that we need to make sure that people understand that where we're at. I know not too long ago there were conversations that, well, capacity in our schools, we shouldn't build housing because of school capacity, which was not an accurate depiction. And again, I think it's one of the areas where we have the opportunity to share an important message. So thank you for bringing it up, because it's an important message for our community.
From my experience, a lot of experience actually in hearing this, people who are opposed to housing and opposed to that new development that's being proposed down the street can find many, many reasons to oppose it. And counselors, a lot of counselors are new. We have a lot of turnover. I think it's a big problem in our council, 2-year terms. And it takes a while to sit up there, you know this, and hear your neighbors say, but please, and I voted for you. And that's horrible, because it would be bad for the school district, it would be bad for this, it's bad for something. And it takes a lot of people talking about it, and talking about it consistently, and saying, I led the process of the development of the 2040 Corvallis vision statement, and we made a big deal about having it be, we want to be a welcoming community, and that means we have to say, let's support housing, along with a lot of other things, but it takes people talking about it. So thank you.
I really appreciate you bringing this up, because when people oppose affordable housing, you're telling people that have an income of a certain level that they're not welcome in a community or in our schools, and that's a problem to me. And one of the things that makes it hard to know when things are going on in those meetings, because people don't always know where to look. And so that's something I think would be worth considering, if that's something you're advocating for, Ryan, of like public engagement, and that I know a lot of us do as well. Like, where do people find resources to find agendas? Not everybody knows that, and I think that it's fine to tell people like this is how to engage, and not tell them what to engage with, as just a public information thing as we continue to advocate. The housing conversation, I hear that. I'm on hiring committees at OSU for new faculty coming in, and I hear that all the time, is like, how would I ever even be able to afford a house here? And that's the deciding factor for some people that we would love to see coming into the community that work at OSU, and those are positions that they're looking at staying here for good, right? Because those are like the tenure track ones, meaning they're planning on spending until retirement, usually, where they're applying for those positions. And I think that that conversation is worth having a little bit more in depth, as far as how can board members engage with that process. I think you bring up a good point. I personally am always like, what's going on the agenda? I don't know. Then I miss stuff. And so it's really hard, just like people miss stuff here at the budget meetings, or they miss them at our board meetings because we don't know what's going on. And so this public engagement piece, I think, is really important. And I don't know like all the avenues. I know it helps to have things in the paper and things like that. So thanks for being here all the time and everything. So those are just some things I think that we can do a better job of, as far as like informing people like this is how you can engage, and it doesn't influence what they're doing through our positions. And I did want to reemphasize too, when I'm listening to our conversations, and it's really hard because we get a certain dollar amount from the state, and I said this in our last meeting, I've said this like numerous times, that there's like a decrease in the investment from the state in public education, and that we're gonna have to work together as communities to work on that. And I gave information at the last meeting. I hope it shows up in the paper at some point about like how to get involved. Some of the things that were offered in our last meeting was about like reaching out to OSBA. They have the Advocacy 101 training. So I think this is relevant to this conversation because we're talking about the budget, that we have limited dollars that are coming from the state, and you all as district staff are making these decisions that are impacting, we all know that they're impacting people's lives in the community, and that's what's the most heartbreaking part of all of this. And we know it's impacting the students that are in the schools, and I just really hope we can come together as a community to think about all the things you're pointing out with the housing and also with the state piece. Like, that just really needs to happen, and I can't emphasize that enough. Of across the state, we're going to have to come together on that part with the budget decisions and how their money is allocated. It just doesn't make sense. The pace of, like when you were talking about toilet paper and stuff like that, I was like, I know when I buy toilet paper, I have a bunch of kids at my house and it's just us, and that's a huge expense. It's like compared to what it was just a couple years ago, just for something like that, or paper towels, and those costs are going super fast, and it's just not something we can keep up with. And so for when we're talking about the long term, when you're talking about the long term, Therese, and questioning like what's our thinking ahead, that has to be part of that, is like what does advocacy look like, and how can we use our positions to help the community understand that it's like you can engage beyond just here in the local community, and what are the resources, and without telling them what to do per se, if that makes sense. Because I know there's limitations as elected people on telling people, especially as this goes to the state into legislation and ballots and stuff. But anyways, okay, I'm getting really ranty. I just am really like passionate about public engagement with processes. And this is one way when we're here at these budget meetings, and there's so many other pieces that are impacting the money that we're looking at. And I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Sammy?
Yeah, I want to really reiterate what just has been said and put some examples. For the last decade, the conversations has been difficult, and we are the products of, I'm not sure if I should say intentional or by design, trajectory to price out individuals, mainly with children in school age. And that trajectory really has been harmful. I remember, Penny, to the point that you mentioned in 2017, there was a hearing at LaSalle's, and there was a comment from an individual who said, our schools don't have capacity. I checked in. It was the early half of 2017. I checked in the capacity, and I was like, well, I want to testify. Actually, we're open for business. We're open for kids. And we can accommodate whatever additional number we need. Unfortunately, that narrative has been enshrined in the psyche of the testimonies that we heard in City Council for a while. And right now, we are seeing severely declining enrollments coming to the last 8-10 months. The conversation I'm hearing from the community, number one issue on the front of the minds of almost every single person you may ask is affordability of housing. The stories are, I'm thinking about moving out of Corvallis because I can't afford my house. I'm thinking about, or not thinking, already did not want to go back to the job market because she needed to take care of her kids, because the compounding cost of childcare and mortgage for one child is the cost of 2 mortgages, another child the cost of 3 mortgages. It's very expensive to live here and have children here. And the school board did its best. We passed the LRPT and MUCT as incentives for tax increments that could be used to develop more housing, affordable housing. And we're not seeing the product yet in the pace that we need. So while our hands are tied right now with imminent cuts and families whose lives are going to be impacted and kids who are going to be impacted, we do have lots of power and influence that we can do, whether through legislation, advocacy, or city council, or even partnership between the board, budget committees, and PTAs, and really being committed that we need to solve this problem in a timely manner, because the inertia of the design that's really excluding many individuals in Corvallis from being able to afford to live in Corvallis and have kids in Corvallis is so strong, and we can't resolve it only with state budgets, and we can't resolve that situation only with housing. It's going to take both the state budget and the housing crisis. And we are the #1 rent-burdened community in Oregon, period.
Yes, as much as this subject is extremely dear to my heart and is my #1 issue, build more housing, I do think, though, at this point we do need to try and bring it back a little bit more to the budget itself, even though, yes, this is a structural issue that is giving us the problems that we're at. So do we have any more questions for staff?
Yeah, but I had others, so I think Rashonda
Yes.
should go.
Sure.
Thank you. I came in with a long list of questions, and I just want to express my gratitude for folks for all of the thoughtful questions, comments, and discussion that has already happened, because many of them have been answered already. So I'll just reserve for my final two, and also just want to share gratitude for everybody for the thoughtful conversation, both about long-term advocacy as well as the urging from one another and the community to really center student needs now, and that both of those have to come into this balance. So my two relatively quick questions, one is about process. There have been some great emails going back and forth. I know Tisha as well as Therese, and I think others had questions, Lauren, that you provided some really thoughtful answers to over email that helped answer some of the questions in advance from the committee. And I'm wondering if those questions and answers that have been answered over email will be posted in some way to a website or public record so that community members who listened in but maybe didn't see those exchanges also get the answers to those questions.
That's great. Thank you for leading me into that, because I wanted to make sure that we brought it up on the record before we ended tonight. Yes, they have been posted with the exception of the responses that I sent out late this afternoon. So they're posted on the board book link for today's meeting. So I think we're up to, I don't know, 6, 7 pages at this point. So there's additional information for the community if you would like to go review that. The updated version of what was received and responded to through today will be updated tomorrow. I don't want to commit Kim to doing that because she's not here, but that's within her. She can access that. I don't even know how. So we'll get those updated. And if there's any additional questions that come in between now and when we meet again next week, we'll continue that same process, and those will be included in the meeting materials as well. So yes, they are all there. If that's a better format for people, their notes are there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask one more? So I have a question. This is on page 61 of the budget. Just in going back to our reserves question of understanding some of the specific line items. So under 800, other uses of funds, there's 810 planned reserves, which is at the $12 million level. And then the 820 reserved for next year at the $4.7 million level. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand those numbers.
So the 820 planned for next year speaks very specifically to general fund, so that amount aligns with that percentage, that 5%. On page 61, you're looking at requirements by reporting object all funds. So that has the reserve amounts for all funds as it notes there. So the other funds that we keep a reserve in are our debt service funds. So there we have 2 debt service funds. One is for our PERS bond obligation, and then one is from the general obligation bonds for the facility improvements. So we have to pay back those dollars. We keep a reserve fund. Typically, it is recommended that you have at least the first payment of the next year after the budget cycle in reserves. Those monies are very specific and would not be able to be used for anything else. I am not sure about the borrowability of them, but from my understanding, they're specific for those purposes. The other funds that make up a large portion of that we have what are called internal service funds, or the 600 level funds, and that includes, we have a reserve for our certified bargaining group, and we also have a reserve for our classified bargaining group. And so those are monies that they are allowed to carry over year to year, and they use to apply to their insurance benefits. And so the district contributes money there based on our contractual agreements with those groups, and then they get to use the reserve as they see best for their members. So that's a big chunk of that. And we also have one other small internal service fund that is set aside for risk management. So if we have something, say, for example, maybe our legal fees far out exceeded what we budgeted, or we had a settlement or something of that nature, we have to have a little bit of money set aside there to be able to handle those instances. Also, for example, we had earlier this year the flooding that happened at Sheldon. Some of those costs exceeded what our insurance coverage was, and so we had to pay cash for those. And so we have a little bit of money set aside there to be able to handle those unexpected risk type scenarios.
Thank you.
Any other questions for staff? Therese?
So going to the function of the budget committee and the things that we do or don't do, one of the things that we are supposed to do is determine that the parameters of this budget follow specific things. And one of those things is the goals of the district. So I just I am going to advocate one more time that we evaluate and consider as a group whether or not some of the reductions are consistent with some of the specific points of our goals. So in looking, I did not assess the equity goal this way because it breaks my brain to try to do that, to be honest, because I'd have to circle all of them. So I just thought, okay, let me look at the ones that are a little more specific to the student achievement pieces.
Page 25, I think, is what you're looking for.
Yes, that's good. Thank you. I didn't put a sticky on it. So let me do that. Okay. So in thinking about the scope of changes that some of the staffing would lead to, some of the staffing changes are not going to, they're going to leave the services still at least largely intact. Looking at the goals and looking at the capacity for particularly the library changes, but maybe to some extent the art or music changes as well. When I look at these, I struggle to think that the level of change, particularly in the libraries, is keeping the spirit of these goals, particularly around excellent learning experience, where I see 3 of the 5 would be directly impacted by a reduction in library, 3 of the 5 in relevant and engaging learning, and 3 of the 5 in healthy communities. Our library services directly touch those, and we are not talking about a small reduction. We are talking about literally half of access to for our elementary students to a library. This is going to change how they perceive the function of libraries forever, all the way until they're in college, and you're pleading with them to go to the library and ask the reference librarian for help finding appropriate references because Wikipedia is not one. And they will struggle because it's got to be ingrained in very early, right? So how they're going to view libraries, their access to reading material, their access to culturally appropriate reading material. I know that this plan has left in some prep, but I also know that it is not enough prep for them to curate a relevant collection for their individual schools. So from my perspective, that particular change, I don't see that upholding our district goals and strategies effectively. I think that the level of change that's being proposed there is significant enough to say it functionally decimates the value of the elementary library. And that is the years when we most need them to believe that their librarians can save the world, because that's why they'll go back to them later for all kinds of things. I know we could say this about mental health and art and music as well. However, the price tag for libraries feels attainable to me and restores a service to an appropriate level at a price tag, $177,000. I just think there has to be a place where we can find that $177,000 to save our elementary libraries. They touch directly 3 of our 4 goals by more than half of the points in those goals. Cutting library services makes the ability to fulfill those goals much harder, and that does not even account for the strategies that the district is relying on and the role that the libraries will have in the strategies addressed that we have designed to address these goals, and the sub-strategies, the measurements of on-time reading, grade level reading by 3rd grade. It's going to be far harder to achieve if our students don't have access to a librarian, if they don't have access to the library space reliably. So staying within the scope of what the budget committee is supposed to do, which is evaluate if the proposed changes support the district strategies, I am saying I don't think that the changes to the library support the district strategies for our goals, and it needs to be reevaluated.
Okay. Tisha?
Just said, I think if you look at Goal 3, Strategy 1, it specifically calls out art.
I was more like the psychological services going down by 50%, and I know we've had questions about that, and so I wanted to come back to that on like how that one was decided. It's not related to what Teresa said, it's a whole nother shift, so if somebody else had another question or anything to respond to with that, but okay, Sarah has one about libraries first.
So my older kid started school in the Corvallis School District when there was no elementary school library. Or there was a library, there was no librarian. The library was in a room, one classroom. And we saw a really community building process when librarians were brought into the schools. And it had a profound effect on how that elementary school felt and the things kids were involved in and excited about. My kid was one of the first, in the first year that they were able to have OBOB at their elementary school. And there's nothing more exciting than watching a bunch of kids cheer about books. The ability to build collections that are meaningful has been an effort over years that has been funded by the foundation, it's been funded by PTAs, and it feels like we have made this amazing accomplishment. We've made these amazing strides in the collections, the opportunities, the community, the excitement we've built in our schools around our libraries, and it's disappearing. It's a huge loss to our schools. It's a huge loss to elementary schools. It's a huge loss at a time when we are struggling with literacy. And I agree with Teresa. This is something that we really need to look at, finding a way to put that back into our elementary schools, because it is important for those schools. It is important for those kids, and building a foundation in how they feel about their education, how they feel about accessing. Libraries are accessing the world for them. And we need to keep that in place for our kids. Not every kid gets to go to the public library once a week with their family or whatever. And so having those libraries is really key.
I think for me, I agree that our libraries are critical, and I am also a huge supporter of the arts and including music, and so it's hard for me to say we have to advocate for one without the others, and so I would ask the budget committee to keep that into consideration. Like, I don't feel comfortable saying like we have to keep these positions or this line without advocating for all of them, and because it makes it a really hard conversation. And I know that the role that art plays in helping students express themselves and being able to process life, and I've seen it change lives so much, like how it was explained earlier was really like emotional for me, because I've seen that happen in higher ed too, about it actually literally saving people from experiencing life in different ways. And I also am looking at like how can we look at the psychological services, and like I don't have an answer of where we would get the money though, and that's the hard part, and that's what makes it the most difficult, is like we can advocate for those, but like we're not offering like where. And this 50% reduction on, we didn't even talk about that at all tonight, like how that was decided in the public forum. And I know that that's a big one, especially with the impacts, continued impacts of the pandemic. I've said this in another meeting, but like the kindergartners right now are the first group of students that wouldn't have had some sort of impact from like either remote learning or COVID restrictions in their education. So we have a long ways to go as far as the mental health of students, and it's not going to get remedied in 1 year. And so I have a lot of concern on the psychological services, knowing that those are literal like interventions, life or death situations for some students, and it's really hard to see that reduction. And I know it's hard for you all to make that reduction, and I want to recognize that part. And so I wish I had how many millions of dollars that we need in my pocket to hand you all personally, because if I did, I sure would, or even half of it. Like, I'd be like, take my money, but I don't have money like that. And but I did want to voice that part too, because that one, the 50% variance is a lot, and I can't remember what the reason was for that one. If you wanted to answer that one, maybe.
I don't want to speak to a program that's not mine specifically, that is under our student services coordinator, but the decision there, we really were going back and forth between, in our mental health program is comprised, we have a manager, is that what she is called? Supervisor. We have a supervisor, and then we also have the mental health therapist, and then we have the skills trainers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's my understanding that the skills trainers are required to work under the mental health therapist. And to make the reduction that we need, we were going back and forth between, do we reduce the number of therapists, that therefore we would have to reduce the number of skills trainers as well, because they cannot work without the mental health therapist. And we did preserve the licensed mental health therapist, FTE, and unfortunately, I mean, like you mentioned, there wasn't a choice that was great in this whole scenario. And we chose to preserve those licensed mental health providers at the same level.
That's helpful for the community to know like that, because of I know that it's such a gap that's being filled in the community with having the licensed folk being able to see them because of the shortage in mental health support in general across the United States, and that's, like, Corvallis is not an exception there. So I appreciate that, but I really am like, that's a big drop down. I don't have a way for you all to figure out another place, and I trust that you've looked everywhere for it, because you all have been like looking pretty anguished over there around all of this as we're talking about it.
Yeah, these have been incredibly difficult decisions. And as I shared at the board meeting last couple weeks ago, these are decisions that we don't want to have to make either. And we know that it has impacts on individuals and families, and it stinks. And we have to make some hard decisions, because that's the job we have. But yeah, it's been difficult, to say the least.
Oh, it's Chris and then Tisha.
Oh, thank you. Lou, I wanted to second what you said, Dr. Whitebear. I just think that all the cuts are very difficult, and they all really are embedded in our goals. And so I would love to speak for hours on the need for mental health supports, but I understand why and how we're making those cuts. I wonder about, can you remind us how teachers and staff gave input on cuts, on what they would like to see? Was there consideration to, like, how many like when we looked at librarians, how many direct hours with students there were, and those kind of things? Did staff give input on that?
So the main way that we received input were through our school administrators, who are in schools day in and day out and having to make decisions about their individual buildings. So we started meeting with them in November to talk about reductions, and continued to meet with them several times a month all the way through this process. The other huge driver in these decisions is our collective bargaining agreements. I've seen folks a couple of times tonight look at me quizzically about some of the reductions, and I think one of the reasons that I've gotten that look is because the people are different, but the position stays the same, and that is predominantly the result of seniority and the way that the system works through collective bargaining. So Jennifer has worked for hours and hours trying to do her best to give folks limit the number of buildings people are in while we've been making these reductions. And so I would say that those two pieces have been really key in the decision making that we're bringing forward.
I just wanted to mention that there was an increase in health and guidance in the budget. Increase in health and guidance in the budget.
Thank you. Okay. We are running a little long tonight, so I would just like to make sure are there any more questions or requests for information from staff?
What would you say, Andrew?
We're running long?
Can I just make one really short comment?
Sure.
I promise this is the last one. I promise this is the last one, Andrew. This is like, you're in my role that I'm usually in, trying to keep people going. I think that the increase in costs related to the implementation of the sustainability plan, that's a huge increase, right? It's or a large dollar amount, and I think that that's, as we make decisions and ask that in the future of the district, that we try to keep in mind those kind of impacts, because like sustainability obviously is really important too, but that's a big, like, maybe people may not have thought like this is going to be a huge financial impact as we're implementing the sustainability plan. So I'm not talking down on sustainability or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, it is something that probably may have not been recognized of the dollar amount attached to that, and how it creates other competing things, and it's really hard because I understand the impacts of climate change heavily, especially from an indigenous perspective. And so I want to make sure people know I'm not saying I don't think we need sustainability plans, but it has a dollar attached to it, so.
Would you like me to list the things I have down so far? Sure. So far, and I'm sure that there may be other things, but what I wrote down were questions that we were needed additional time on. One was around reductions in programming beyond music, so CTE was the question. Travel between high schools, orchestra as the example, but what other classes would that equate to? What would the number have needed to be from the state to adequately address our budgetary needs? And also the list of districts used in the comparison of reserves. So those are the 4 that I heard, that I wrote down as we've had the discussion. And so we're opening it up for other information folks need, but you don't have to list those because I already wrote them down.
Technical request, if I may ask. Traditionally, we used to have the budget documents and the budget committee webpage, and also the Q&As as well, listed as PDFs there. If I may request that we do that in parallel or in addition to the board book. I know it's additional work, but makes it easier for the public to access the Q&A there, if that's okay.
So the items that have been brought up as well, art and mental health, I think you could equally say, and people did say, those are particularly with mental health, devastating cuts as well, and much needed service. I had sent in a question about what would happen if the board policy for reserves was changed so that 4% was now the minimum requirement rather than 5%. If that were to go into effect, how much money would that allow us to work with without having to repay it, because we would be changing the board policy so that you wouldn't have to recover that? And I believe that the response that I got was that it would be just a little over $900,000, I think was what you sent to me. So I just want to point out that if we were to change that policy and free up that 1% to be able to be used, that covers all of the library cuts, the art costs, as Lauren communicated to me, and 1/2 of the mental health cuts comes to only $808,000. That's less than that amount. If we restored all of mental health and all of library and did not tackle art in this go around, it would be just over 1 million. So that we have the ability to pursue discussion. I understand we have a timeline. I want to be really clear that we have a timeline. I also want to be clear that we are allowed to do this in a first reading if we think that is in the best interest of the budget. And I think that's something that the board leadership should discuss, whether that is viable. The community has been very clear about these programs. They have commented many, many times about them. I feel like if we did that, if we were to do that in one reading, I don't think we're going to hear people say, you didn't have a second reading, because we would be making this, we would be doing this with the intention of preserving what has been determined by many people to be experienced as critical services for the district. So there is a way, that is the way that I would suggest that we explore this, because it is available to us. To the point about long-term, I know that this is not a long-term solution. This is a short-term solution. We have 1 year left in this biennium. We don't know what Salem is going to do after that, but very possibly it will be significantly devastating. I think there is value in giving ourselves one stable year in these services that are very important to our district while we figure out a long-term transition plan if Salem does us wrong again, right? Like, that could happen. And we have that time, and we know that that's coming. And so I would strongly suggest that we have a real conversation about this, not to permanently gut our reserves or overly rely on them, but to say, we are in a crisis. We're in a mental health crisis. We need these services. If we spend our reserves to protect the services, we also can use that as a message to Salem that we think they're so important that we'll change our policy to not get rid of them. Now, are you going to match us in our effort? If we don't spend them, we are saying that we think that the cuts that they are sending us, we're going to figure out a way to survive. And I don't think these cuts are survivable long term. So this is an opportunity for us to give ourselves 1 year, also send a message to Salem, and build in transition. We're going to have a feeling, probably not that long from now actually, about what the climate in Salem is going to be. And we'll have a lot of work to do as a district to figure that out. But we don't have to do this right this moment in this way. We can make a choice to buy ourselves some time, and I think that we should. And I would suggest that we salvage half of the mental health, the libraries, and the art services, because we know the direct impact that those have on our kids.
I have a question about process. Can you even adopt a budget with an anticipation of a potential board change or policy change? Can you adopt a budget in that manner?
So this budget committee can approve the budget, which is what hopefully will happen at our meeting next week. The board still can make a change after that. But to be clear on process, the next scheduled board meeting is June 13th, which is also the budget hearing. I cannot change the budget based on a policy that has not been changed when both of those things are supposed to happen on the same day, because it just won't work. We do have to have a budget adopted by June 30th or the district completely shuts down. We do have the capacity to amend a budget after the fiscal year starts and make changes there. But we have to have a budget adopted by the 30th. So if you were going to look at those things, there would probably be additional special board meetings that are needed. And we also do have very specific posting requirements that we have to do to follow local budget law. So I would have to take all of those and track back those days to make sure we had enough time to meet all of those, because currently with how we have it, the board meeting scheduled on the 13th and the last hearing on the 30th, we are really tight turnaround to do the posting that we are required to do by local budget law.
Okay, I just want to make sure like we don't overstep as board members during the budget meeting, and perhaps we can talk about this as board leadership with you later.
But if I'm understanding Teresa's question right, what I think is like we could potentially, as a committee, decide that we want to dip into that reserve. We can't?
No, you do not get to determine funding levels or impact board policy. The board is the only entity that can do that, not the budget committee.
Thank you. I want to caution us from giving any false hope. It's a difficult place to be in. I've heard from Salem conversations around why reserves are at this level, and it may actually not send the right message. It may really, here's the thing, and I'm now stepping into a policy argument in purpose of really making sure we're sending a message as a budget committee that we're committing allocations with a certain certainty and certain acknowledgments of uncertainties. Here's the certainty of what the policy said and the intention I heard, and maybe the superintendent to the point where maybe the board recently did not have clear examples of events that will serve. From my conversations with board members, and I believe I can claim seniority within the board, they shared examples of when the legislature mid-biennium failed to honor their obligation during the financial crisis. In the middle of the biennium, we had to keep the doors open. And I believe somewhere in 2011, 2012, I'm not sure when exactly, the board had to respond to a catastrophic event, fiscal event, to meet its obligations. That's a catastrophic event. A catastrophic event is something that we did not anticipate, and it's happening, and we can recover from it. Going down to 4% or 12% will be a discussion for the board to consider, but to the point is it will make the cushion thinner and thinner if a catastrophic event happens to us. I'm not saying we are not in a catastrophic situation, a really bad situation. To quote Vikati, with liberty of changing the words a little bit, when he was asked to cut all the fat, he said, I cut all the fat from the government, and then I was left with the flesh, and they told me to cut more, and I was left with only the bones. The best way to represent where we are right now in the long term, we're taking away the soul of public education step by step by cutting all of those important, crucial services for the kids. However, this is not a catastrophic event. This is structural catastrophe that is happening year after year, and now we're seeing its results. And the reserves may give us the cushion temporarily, but it will give us harder fall next year when we end up there. I want us to make sure when we make those decisions in this budget, we're cognizant of where we are. This is a year we're passing a budget with really hard measures, and we're also passing the reserves that we got from a previous generation to the next generation, so they have a little bit of certainty. Those are my 2 cents in terms of whatever we do or say or decide on is not going to give our working families, the kids, our administrators, any hope that we might not be able to meet, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like the conversation is starting to move more towards board policy and not what we as a committee here can do. So I will open it up one last time if there are any further questions for staff about the budget that they can maybe bring an answer to at the next meeting. Sweet. So at this point, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I moved to adjourn.
I didn't do it.
Can I never get to do this. Can I move to adjourn the meeting? Or I would like to move to adjourn the meeting.
I don't think there's anything in policy that prohibits you from moving to adjourn the meeting.
From the,
As a chair.
Yeah.
oh, well, I mean, I don't get to make motions.
Well, that's not a Robert's rule thing, though, I don't think.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a motion. Do we have a second? All right. No. Oh.
I'm moving backwards. What's the process now? Because we didn't, as a budget committee, decide whether we like this budget or not.
So what the process is now, staff will research into the questions that they couldn't answer tonight. They will bring us those answers at the next meeting, at which point we will have our finalized discussion about the budget, and then we will pass the levy rates and hopefully pass the budget. There will be an up and down vote on the budget at the next meeting. So hopefully the next one does not take anywhere near this long. But still need a second so we can get out of here.
I second.
Okay, have a made and seconded. So I'm going to pull some unanimous consent. Is there any objection? No? We're adjourned. We'll be back.
That's the first time that's been used since last week.
So we'll be back on May 30th, right here at 6:30 p.m.